everybody. So today we're going to be talking about more camera settings that are on your camera. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the most common camera settings. Every camera is going to have some slightly different settings. There's some cameras that have really specialized settings for a certain type of photography. So we're just going to cover some of the basic settings that you can expect to find on pretty much every digital camera out there. And in this lecture, and really for the rest of the class, when I'm talking about cameras, I'm referring to cameras that have some type of manual controls like DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, some point and shoots, and well, we're starting to get some of these options in some phones now too. So, but yeah, I'm referring to cameras that would have these options like those. All right, so first off, let's talk about shooting modes. So first off, shooting modes is usually found on the dial at the top. Maybe it's the same dial. It might be the same dial that turns your camera on and off. For this one in particular, it's not. I have a separate button for that. But usually you have some kind of dial, and the most common you're going to see is that M, S, A, and P. And I'm going to talk about some of the other ones a little bit in just a sec. So let's just go over what these basic ones are. So M stands for manual. That's what you guys have been working in, and you have complete control over all of your exposure settings. Now, aperture priority means that you're setting the aperture, but the camera is usually setting the shutter speed and sometimes the ISO. So this is all kind of going to depend on the exact model of camera you have. That's why it's such a good idea to kind of skim through at least the manual when you first buy a camera to see what all the specifics about these settings are for your camera. But usually aperture priority, you're setting the aperture. So when would this be good? Well, when the aperture is the most important thing for your photo. If you want to absolutely make sure that you have a blurred background for every photo and you don't want to mess around with the shutter speeds, then you can go to aperture priority, set it to, F4 or whatever you want, and then the camera will decide the appropriate shutter speed for you to get your meter at 0. So that's something just to keep in mind, that it's keeping your meter, it's basing all of these settings off of your meter being at 0, which, as you found out, is sometimes a great thing, but sometimes you need to under or overexpose depending on your subject. Now, aperture priority is going to be something very so a similar mode that is on a lot of cameras is portrait mode. So portrait mode is basically just going to say large aperture, so we get less depth of field in that blurry background, and then it's going to set the other settings to whatever will get your meter to 0. So that's basically what portrait mode usually does. Okay, so shutter priority is the same except with shutter speed. So you're setting the shutter speed. So let's say it's absolutely important, you're photographing a sports game and you need to make sure that you're getting the action frozen. Then you want to make sure that you're at a really fast shutter speed. So you set that fast shutter speed and your camera decides what your aperture and sometimes your ISO is going to be. Something that's similar is usually sometimes there's a sports mode on cameras, and that sports mode is doing exactly that. It's going to be using a fast shutter speed, and then the other settings are just adjusted in order to get your meter back to 0. Okay, so program is usually like one step up from auto in a way. So the camera still sets your aperture and shutter speed, but you can change things like the white balance and the ISO. But yeah, it's just like one step really from auto, because auto sets everything. Camera does everything. It decides everything. You just, click the button and that's it. So, when is it a good time to use these? I mean, it's really going to depend on when you're shooting. I personally like all the controls, so I always, pretty much always leave my camera on manual because I want to be making all of those decisions. Now, there might be some times where it's just going to be faster to use these other type of modes. And there's photographers, professionals out there that use these modes all the time. So it just kind of depends on what you're shooting. Okay. Moving on to exposure compensation. So exposure compensation usually looks like, so I have a dial on my camera, and it's this, it looks, I mean, similar to what, the meter is, right? We have a 0, we have a -1, a +1, +2, +3, -2, -3. So this is you telling your camera that my photo is, too dark, so I'm going to go to +1 stop. So what's the difference between this and just manually changing the that's a great question. I still don't really use this because I know how to change aperture and shutter speed in ISO. But really the most important time to use this is going to be if you're using one of those other modes, like aperture priority or shutter priority, because the mode is still trying to get your meter to 0. So if you want to be using aperture priority, but you're shooting something that you need to under or overexpose for, then you can just use your exposure compensation and change it so it's affecting the meter differently. Now, what exactly it's changing depends on the mode and depends on the camera. So I believe when I looked up the information for my camera specifically, basically it's changing my ISO. So do I really, if I want to make it lighter, I can make my own decision if I want to make a more sensitive ISO or changing another setting instead. But yeah, but it is used quite a bit by professionals who like to use those other modes. So I'm not discounting it. It's just not my preference of shooting, but it might work for your shooting and your type of shooting really well. Just kind of depends. There are really no right or wrong answers with any of these settings, like what should I use? It's really a preference, and there's going to be a time and place for any of these settings to be used. Alrighty. Let's talk about quality settings. So on your cameras, there's usually in the menu somewhere where you can set the quality setting. And if you notice here, these three are all JPEG, and we do have some other settings. We have RAW and JPEG, and then we have RAW. So before I get into, why don't we talk about the difference between RAW and JPEG first, and then I'll talk about the why one of these is going to be better than the other. Okay, so, whoops, well, let's move everything back up. Okay. So shooting in RAW versus JPEG. So RAW files are uncompressed files. They have all of the data that your camera has captured with the image. This can be really, really important. Now, the one downside, and it kind of just depends, they do have larger file sizes, really large file sizes. So when it comes to buying, hard drives, you're going to want to have one with more space if you're shooting with RAW, because it's going to be taking up more space. Your backup drives, all of that stuff is going to have to be larger. And I don't know, it's just something that you deal with. Now, JPEG files are compressed files, which means that there is less information and there's smaller file sizes. Now, I've heard people say, well, I like the look of my JPEGs more. And usually when you're shooting, what's happening is your camera applies if you're shooting a JPEG, it applies a preset to it. Usually it has like a little bit of contrast and maybe a bit of a color boost. So that's usually why people are like, no, I like how my JPEGs look. It's because it's already had the contrast applied. Whereas with RAW files, you're just getting the straight file. No type of editing has been pre-applied to it, because you're going to get to have the most control over all that stuff. So anyways, JPEG files are compressed, they have less information, and they have smaller file sizes, which can be a pro in some situations. Now, RAW files can only be opened and viewed in specific softwares. So Lightroom can open up pretty much all raw files. If you buy a newer camera and Lightroom can't open it, it's usually just an update that needs to be done to Lightroom, because they add new camera information all the time. Now, JPEG files can be opened and viewed on any device. You can text them to people. You can post them online. So that's the good side of having JPEG files. Now, with RAW, you do have much more control when you're editing, whereas JPEG, because it's compressed and it's compressed a lot of the information out of the file, you have less control. So raw files are especially important when you're going to print an image, because you have all that extra information in there. But JPEGs do have a faster turnaround time, and this can be more important for online usage. So if you absolutely know that you're shooting, let's say, an event, and you know that you're only going to be posting them online for your client or for yourself, then you're never ever going to print any of these images, then shooting in JPEG might make more sense. Now, another reason is a day of event situations. And so, for example, there are some wedding photographers that will shoot the wedding, and as the couple and the guests are traveling to the reception site, these wedding photographers are creating a slideshow to show at the reception. Now, this isn't all photographers, and usually it's a team of people that are working. So these are usually pretty high-end wedding photographers, but I have heard of it happening. So, so that would be a reason to shoot JPEG. Now, let's go back up to this list right here. The scenario I just described, if I was that photographer, I would be shooting both RAW and JPEG. JPEG because I need to get those files done and ready for the slideshow to show at the reception. RAW because I'm hoping my couple, they're going to be buying a bunch of images from me. And so I want to have RAW files so I can create the best quality images possible for printing. If you want to just shoot it in RAW, that's fine. If you're not worried about a fast JPEG turnaround because you know you're going to put them in Lightroom and export them as JPEGs later, you can just shoot in RAW. Because if you are shooting RAW and JPEG, that's obviously going to be taking up more space on your memory card. Now, when it comes to these different JPEGs, it has to do with the amount of compression. So standard is going to have the most compression and the smallest file sizes, and whereas extra fine is going to have the least amount of compression, but a little bit larger sizes. So you could tell that, the big thing that you're always balancing with this is that, how much information do you want? How good a quality do you want versus how much space do you want the files to take up? If space isn't an issue, I shoot RAW. My personal preference, I shoot RAW for pretty much everything, just because I think I never know if I'm going to want to print something. What if I do want to print something? What if I want to throw this in Photoshop and combine it in something else? I like to keep my options open. So I shoot in RAW all the time. And my storage devices are huge. I think I'm working on an 8 terabyte right now. So, it's the price to pay for those possibilities. So a little bit more information on RAW files. Again, the uncompressed image file contains the maximum amount of information from your camera. Now, the file extension depends on the camera manufacturer. So, for example, so let's talk about JPEG for a second. JPEG is always going to be .jpg or .jpeg. That doesn't matter. JPEG is JPEG. Now with RAW files, it depends on the manufacturer. So here, these are just a few. Every manufacturer basically has their own file extension for their RAW files. But so .nef is Nikon, .cr2 is Canon, .arw is Sony. Okay. Don't worry about this because that's a mistake. I moved that somewhere else. All right, so anyways, an uncompressed file makes for better image quality because you just have more data to work with. And you do get better results when you're editing. So for example, adjusting the white balance, adjusting the exposure, recovering your highlights, which means bringing the information and the details back into your highlights, opening up your shadows or making your shadow areas lighter so that you can actually see what's going on in there. This is all much easier and looks better when you're working with a raw image. You can still do all these things with a JPEG, but it's not going to look nearly as good if you put it side by side with a raw image. Sharpening images, you get better results. Noise reduction definitely gets better results. So noise reduction, if you have to shoot at a high ISO, let's say you're at an awesome concert, you're shooting, it's really dark, so you have no choice but to shoot with a high ISO, you can reduce the amount of noise in editing. It works okay with JPEG. It a lot of times works wonderfully with RAW. So again, it comes down to the type of shooting you're doing and what situation you're in to choose between RAW and JPEG. Another great thing is that you can avoid banding. So what I mean by banding is if you've ever seen like an image, let's say online, where there's there's a nice sky, but the sky has like these lines where you can see like different colors of blues going down. That's banding. And that basically happens for a couple of reasons. But when we're talking about RAW versus JPEG, it's more off. It usually happens with JPEGs because there's not enough colors to create a smooth gradient. So because of that compression, maybe there's just not enough colors to do that. Whereas RAW, you're going to have those colors. Another reason the banding happens is, and it just comes down to not enough colors, period, but it has to do with resolution, which we'll talk about a bit more later. Not having enough resolution in your images means it's going to do the same thing, not having enough colors. So yeah, definitely want to avoid that. Now, the other nice thing about RAW is that you can return to that RAW file later and edit it differently. And this is just a fact of the matter, is that as new photographers, you're probably going to over edit. We're going to get into editing in Lightroom pretty soon, and yeah, you're probably over edit. I remember when I first started, every single one of my photos was super sharp and super saturated colors, and I thought it looked great then, and now I look back and I kind of cringe a bit. So as you continue in your photographer journey, your eye will become more refined to see what you like and what you don't like, and for what situations. But with RAW, you can go back and re-edit. So I can go back to my photos from 10-15 years ago that are RAW files and edit them better with my better eye. Okay, moving forward, let's talk about drive modes. So drive modes are basically when you take your photo and you hit that shutter, what is actually happening. So there's single drive mode, you hit it and it takes one photo. Continuous shooting means you hold it down and it's taking continuous photos as long as you're holding down the button. Speed continuous is going faster, doing the same thing but faster and faster. Now you're probably thinking, well, why wouldn't you just do speed all the time? First of all, it takes up more battery. So if battery is an issue, then yeah, definitely don't want to be using a setting that's taking up battery for no reason. So if you're shooting something that's moving and you're trying to catch that moment, doing that speed priority might be helpful in that moment. But if you're doing a portrait where someone's standing completely still, there's not really a reason to use speed continuous. Now, if you're doing a portrait with kids in it and so they're not standing still, then you would want to go to speed continuous. Yeah, definitely. So, for example, let me pull it up on my camera real quick. Okay, so I have it set right now to, well, let's go with single first. So single. Okay. Now let's go back to Drive mode, continuous shooting. Okay, so I'm getting a continuous amount of photos going through. Now let's go ahead and try speed. Ooh, that's a lot faster, right? Now, the only thing, oh, and I just killed my battery. So the only thing, you know, with when you're doing speed continuous, there's usually only so many photos per second that your camera can take. And that's going to change depending on your camera. And so that's one of the things that makes more expensive cameras more expensive, is that sometimes it's that feature. Some cameras, you can get, I think, like 8 frames per second, right? Whereas cameras that aren't as expensive might only do like 4 frames per second. So that's sometimes the difference in camera prices. Some other drive modes, self-timer. So a lot of cameras usually have 2 seconds or 10 seconds or both. This is great for a couple of things. One, when you want to get it in the photo too, obviously, right? I've done this at family reunions so many times. Set the self-timer, jump in, get a shot. Another time is if you're shooting really long or slow shutter speeds, especially if you don't have a shutter release cable. So a shutter release cable is a cable that plugs into your camera, and then you can hit a button and it will take a photo without you actually having to touch the camera. Because if we're doing a slow shutter speed, it's going to pick up any little movement. Even if you're on a tripod, if you hit that shutter, it might slightly move. So you don't want that. And one thing is to have that shutter release cable. But if you don't have that, you can set the self timer so that you can hit the timer and then back away from your camera. 2 seconds goes by and then it takes the photo. So that's a pretty practical reason to use it. Self-timer continuous can be pretty awesome. Not all cameras have this, definitely. Usually a little bit higher end cameras. It depends, things are changing all the time. But for example, you can set it up that, after waiting 10 seconds, your camera then takes like 5 images in a row. So this is actually what I use for my family reunion stuff because I don't want to have to keep going back and forth, right? So yeah, that could be really nice, especially in these big group situations where it's going to be impossible to get every single person's eyes open in the same photo. This can be super helpful because then you can combine images so it looks like everyone had their eyes open. All right, last but not least, let's talk about bracketing. So what bracketing does is it takes a photo and then it also takes the photo at different exposures. So it uses that, it's like a combination of exposure compensation, okay, with speed shooting, I guess, in a way. Well, it takes the same photo and then and you can set it how much difference it does. If you want like 5 images total and you want 2 that are overexposed and 2 that are underexposed by 1 stop each. So you can take 1 photo and then the camera will take a photo that's 2 stops underexposed, 1 stop underexposed, 1 right at 0 on the meter, 1 under, 1 over and 2 under. Now, I've met some people who use this just because they're not comfortable with their own metering. And so, they want to make sure they have these other photos. A practical reason to use this is for HDR photography, which means high dynamic range. So high dynamic range photos are a combination of these different photos. So if you've ever taken a photo and you'll have these situations, maybe you haven't had it yet, but you'll have these situations where the contrast is too wide in the photo. So you have parts of the image that are completely white, parts of the image that are completely black, because the contrast is just way too wide for your camera to capture in one shot. So in this case, You have a photo that you have multiple exposures of a photo that you can then combine in Photoshop to create an image that has the look of the full tonal range. Okay, moving forward. Oh, we're getting kind of long on this video, aren't we? Okay, so autofocus. There's single shot autofocus, continuous autofocus, and manual focus. So some of the differences, oops, sorry. All right. So some of the differences, single shot autofocus is you get your focus point going, you take one shot. Continuous autofocus you usually use with a moving subject, and so it tracks the movement and keeps the focus. That's another thing that makes some cameras more expensive, is that the better this works, the more expensive that camera probably is. Manual focus means that you are choosing the focus. So, for example, on the zoom lens here, I have this part of the lens is what makes it zoom, but this part is actually for focusing. So if I want, I can focus and not have autofocus. So if you have a situation where autofocus just doesn't seem to be working, it could be that the object is too close or too flat, or a couple of other situations that you would have to switch over to manual focus. Another time is if it's too dark. If it's really dark outside, you just can't see anything, then manual focus, you'll have to manual focus for your camera to be able to take the photo. And you have to switch to that mode for it to work. Now, we're going to talk about lenses a little later, but like this lens is not a zoom lens, it's a prime lens. And we'll talk about what that means. Well, it basically means not zoom. But so this ring here, there's no zoom ring, there's just a manual ring. And there's also this ring here that has different, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Different distances. So this is going to be the distance of how far away you're trying to focus, and in night situations having a lens that has this is pretty essential. But anyways, we're going to talk about more about lenses later on this semester. All right, let's move on. This is the last part here. So we have, and one of the most important things actually, color spaces. So most cameras come with two options for color spaces: sRGB or Adobe RGB 1998. Now there's some pros and cons, and people argue about which one's best all the time. As I've said over and over, it really just depends on the situation. There's great times to use sRGB, there's great times to use Adobe RGB. Me personally, I keep my camera on Adobe RGB. So now sRGB is the default on most cameras. If you haven't played with the setting, your camera is probably set to sRGB right now. Now, the issue is that sRGB does have less colors in the color space. It can only create a certain amount of colors, whereas Adobe RGB has about 35% more colors that it can reproduce. So if the color is really important to your images, especially if you're doing anything with companies who have very specific colors, Adobe RGB might be the place where you want to go. Now, sRGB is used on all devices, phones, TVs, laptops. Any digital device that has a display is going to be using sRGB. So for that reason, you can post the file online right away and not worry about converting it to sRGB. With Adobe RGB 1988, there's more colors, so it is better for printing. You have more space to play with those colors and editing as well. So for creative uses, I just always think more colors are better, right? Now you do have to convert to sRGB before posting online. If you post an Adobe RGB 1998 color spaced image online, it's going to look flat. So it's just something to know. Now, if you might be thinking, well, if I have to convert to it anyways, why wouldn't I just start in it? When you convert, you still have those colors, but they're converted in a different way. It's really technical. Like I said, I personally like shooting in Adobe RGB 1998. I don't mind converting because I'm working in, I'm either exporting out from Lightroom where I can do a very quick, just switch one little thing in the export box and now I'm converted, no big deal. If I'm working in Photoshop, same thing. It's just part of my workflow. So I don't mind the converting at all. I don't see what the big deal is. But there's people out there that are like, that absolutely hate Adobe RGB. There's some people that absolutely hate sRGB. I don't know. It just depends on the situation. Okay. I would say that if you're going to be shooting in JPEG, you might as well just be shooting in sRGB because you're not really worried about having the advanced controls when editing anyways, right? So, and it's going to make your workflow a lot faster, like I said, in those situations where you have to have a really quick turnaround. Okay, so I did add this post here. Is completely optional for you guys to read, but if you guys want to read a little bit more about the arguments for and against sRGB and Adobe RGB, that's there for your own reading pleasure. But anyways, so that is some of the basic controls that are available on most cameras. Again, to really know what your camera does, look over that your camera manual and take some time to kind of try to understand what all these things are. You're going to get the most out of your camera when you know the most about it.